These projects are designed to cultivate multiple skill sets that complement a series of videos created for the purpose of acquiring a foundational knowledge of the Python programming language. These projects will cover coding both console-based and GUI applications. Tkinter is a Python binding to the tk.GUI toolkit, and its framework is built into Python's standard library, so it does not require the installation of any additional modules. This makes Tkinter a convenient choice for building graphical interfaces for Python applications. All source code in these videos is available at the 1 byte at a time GitHub repository. You will find a link to the code used in each video beneath it, in its description and comment section. You may use these links to download the source code.
This Tkinter project is just a simple, small graphical emailer. And this time we're going to set up our GUI inside of a class. And then we'll instantiate or build an instance of that class, and we'll call main loop on the window, and window is passed in as a parameter or argument to the constructor of the object when we build it. Let's see what that looks like.
The Python Tkinter GUI.
So here's our interface. All right, we've instantiated our class and our GUI, and in our GUI we have these entry objects here defined in code. We have these labels all defined in code, and it just says hello mail. Okay, so I'm going to close that.
The Python Tkinter code.
You'll need a couple of things that are just built into a typical Python installation. So tkinter as tk, and then another instance as ttk in this case, tk.Lib, which is built in, and that lets you use sendmail, and then email my multipart, in this case an email my text, which we're going to use to pass parameters to, or a parameterized list to sendmail. So think of that as sort of an extension of a list or an array. It's a class of object that could take like a key value pair. All right, so like a variable name and then a value for that, and we'll pass that to sendmail. Now, there's probably 100 different ways to do this, but when I create a graphical GUI window, I like to do it up top, like where you would place your globals. So it's easy to modify, easy to change things. And then typically what I'll do, I'll set a title, in this case for my app, and then width and height. These are just two variables. And then I want to get the screen width and the screen height, and I store that in two more variables. Then I have this variable here appear in the middle, and it catches the result of subtracting the window width from the screen width and dividing by 2, and the window height from the screen height and dividing by 2. That effectively would give me the middle, or cause that window to appear in the middle of the screen. We don't know the resolution at runtime, but this makes it a bit dynamic, so that way we can be sure that our app appears in the middle. It's one way of doing it. So the geometry is set to be the result stored in this variable here, appear in the middle. And it's the width and height are resizable. That's set to false. So in this case, I don't want them to be able to change the size of the window. It's fixed. And then I'm setting the background here with configure. Now this GUI here, I have it up here in my global namespace, and I initialize it to none. So it acts like a pointer. And then using that, if you're familiar with C++, acts like a pointer to an object in memory. And if you're not, well, don't worry. We'll discuss that in many other videos later after this one. So what that points to, down here, I build my class. Okay, my whole GUI interface is contained inside of a class. It's defined in a class. So I take that pointer, that GUI, which was pointing to a null object, nothing, and I initialize it by instantiating or building an emailer. And then as a parameter, I pass in the window. That gives me the graphical context on which I can paint all my widgets and everything. And then, typically with any Tkinter app, you're going to want to start window.mainLoop. And that's the main loop that all the widgets run inside of. So just recognize that's that pointer. And what I'm doing is, my GUI is defined in this class here, class emailer GUI. So I'm using it to instantiate or build an object built from the blueprint of this class as it is defined. Class is just a blueprint of an object contains functions, methods, data members that all pertain to that object. You know, what an object is, what an object does. And in other videos, we'll talk about, you know, what classes are, why we use them. But typically, you'll see a lot of people defining their tk.Enter GUI interfaces inside of classes. And there's a lot of benefit you get from that. So up here at the top of our class, these are the data members. Think about the things you would need for a typical email app: the sender, the recipient, the port, the server, the password, the subject, and the message. And we'll try to keep it as simple as possible. So skipping this method, we'll come back to it. But first thing we have to do is actually define our GUI interface, okay?
The constructor of a class is always prefixed with 2 underscores and then the keyword in it, and then postfixed with 2 trailing underscores. Example.
So, and this is the constructor of our class. Remember, constructor always begins, you define underscore, underscore, init, underscore, underscore, and then you'll want to pass in self. And then in this case, this is the root window, all right? So master equals none. You know, in this case, this is the root window, and there's only one window. And then these are things we'll use with our GUI. They're defined in the constructor. Constructor is that special function. It's called every time you instantiate or build something from a class.
tk.Enter widgets listen for events that are triggers, such as a mouse click or key press. When a widget detects its trigger event, it calls its corresponding event handler method.
And then these are event handlers, all right? This is what happens. We only have one button that listens to an event. So, you know, that event listener listens for an event that's a trigger. And when it hears that trigger, it goes and it calls the event handler. Okay, so we'll come back to that, and we'll come back to this. But the first thing we had to do was define our graphical GUI interface. So we set the main window, TK frame master. Right, that's the root. That's just the main window, and you could have more than one window. You could have dozens of windows that appear, and they could be children windows that are instantiated and created inside the parent window. But in this case, this is a simple app, just one window, one parent. All right, so we create it, we instantiate it from tk.Frame, and then here we configure, and we're just going to pass in some parameters, the height and width. We're going to set it to a border of 3. Relief flat, that'll affect the look of the border, and the background color. Okay, it's all in hexadecimal. And then anchor northwest, we're going to place, so we're using absolute positioning in Python, and northwest quadrant would be up and to the left. Okay, that's where we want the uppermost leftmost quadrant. And then we're setting the height and the width and the x and y coordinate. Okay, so 0, 0 for the left, you know, top right corner. We're going to add a label from tk.Label, and again set the background color and foreground, and we're going to configure, you know, justify everything to the left on that label, to the west, and then set the font and the text. Okay, and that's just the text that appears on the label. And again, we're going to use absolute positioning and place it in the northwest quadrant. All right, set the width, x and y coordinates. Another label will be sender. And I'm going to speed up now, but you know, the code is self-explanatory. You can look at the code, and this will all be posted on GitHub. Okay, so I'll put a link in under the video, and you can go to GitHub, and if you want to, I recommend typing this in from scratch if you really want to learn tk.Enter. You use this project to help you learn and remember tk.Enter. Well, if you're a tactile or kinesthetic learner, you'll learn by doing. You'll learn by typing the code in yourself and making mistakes, and then fixing those mistakes and debugging. Then it'll actually stick in your memory. But if you want to just run it, copy and paste it from GitHub, you can do that too. I'll put the link at the bottom. All right, so labels, we have a tk entry object, which is what we need to take our input. Okay, so for all the labels, you know, like for sender, for recipient, for port, we have entry objects here. And these are all declared and then configured and then placed using absolute positioning and place. And then this just sets some default values down here, which we can change. But when the window first loads, we'll have those default values loaded up in there, right? Okay, So let's see what happens when we run it. So here's our graphical user interface, our GUI, right? And it appears in the middle where we want it. We can see that these are the text entry objects. So the default values are loaded in, but we could change that if we wanted to. We could change it to some other address. And then the port, and then in this case I'm going to use the SMTP server that's typical for M365, or you could use Gmail. And then the password, I'll have to put the password in. And then you can set the subject of the email and then the message body, okay? And then these are just the labels we added. The only interactive object here, that's, we have one button, and that one button, that TK button, is going to send, once we click it, it will listen for an event, all right? And as it listens for that event, when it hears that trigger, it will go and call an event handler. So if you've worked with Java before, graphical interfaces, or if you've worked with C++ and MFC or C#, it is very similar to that same process. So for a graphical object, you can set an event listener, and that creates like a trigger. And when that trigger is detected, it'll go call the corresponding event handler, okay? And that's the send button. So let's close our interface for now. And here's our one sort of interactive object. We're adding this send button, this TK button, to the interface. And here's the special part of the code that we need to tell it where to find the event handler. So in this case, command equals, and then it's handle button send. You could call it anything you want, but I usually prefix my event handlers with handle or event something, and just that way I can group them all together when I list them and I go through the code. All right, so let's go take a look at handle button send. And also notice I don't have to include the parentheses here. If I were invoking or calling a normal method or function, I would include empty parentheses for it, but I don't have to do that here because I'm simply defining the command as this is the event handler, handle button send. So let's go to it. Here's handle button send. And look at the space that I have to define the event handler. In this case, I'm in the sort of the namespace of the constructor. Here's a constructor for my GUI class, object itself. All right, so remember we're inside the email or GUI class. This is the class definition. This is the instructor, underscore init underscore self. That's always how you define the constructor of a class in Python. It's a little bit different from maybe Java or C++, where the constructor would always have the same name as the class definition itself. Not that way in Python. In Python, it's always going to be, def and then underscore init underscore. So in the scope of this constructor method, and remember everything works by indentation in Python, here's where I want to define my event handlers. In this case, I only need one when they click the send button. So what happens when they click the send button? Well, these are my entry objects, okay, on the form, on the app itself, on the window. And I'm just going to call the get method, and that returns a string value and assigns it, in this case, to these variables. Now, I have to use self because it refers to an object defined in the class itself. In this case, I'm using this class to define my window, my GUI. So I have to take self as an argument up here in the constructor. And then if I do take self as an argument in the constructor, I'm allowed to reference and assign values to objects stored inside my class definition. So that's what I do. And then finally, after I get all that data, and I store it in these variables, okay, and I get the message, and this one's a little bit different because in this case, rather than being an entry object, I've got to use, let me get down here and we'll actually look at that. So text message is a tk.text object, right? Okay, whereas these up here, these were tk entries. Well, tk entries, it's okay if you only want one line of text, but if you want multiple lines of text, which is what we wanted in this case, we don't want to use an entry object, we want to use a text object. So this is the only one that's different here, and the reason is as the message body, potentially they could type paragraphs of text into it, right? So that object needed to be different. an entry object would not be adequate for that. Then finally, we're going to call this function self.emailThem. That's just another method, another function defined inside of our class. Now, you could have just put the code for that here, but I prefer to keep, I like to break everything up into smaller chunks, smaller functions. And so I like to keep my event handler separate, and then other than just grabbing basic input from the form or the window, if there's some processing that's going to go on, I always like to put that in a separate function. But you don't have to do that. You could take all the code that I defined in this function and you could just put it right under the event handler if you want to. But when you get a large complex window where you might have dozens of event handlers listening for dozens of triggers, then it becomes more convenient to organize your code into smaller, distinctly separate functions, and then you can just call or invoke them from the message handler. So let's go to that method and see what it does. Email them, and again, typically any function, any method you define inside a class is going to take self as an argument, because you'll want to access objects defined inside that class. And self is the way you do it in Python. Sort of like the this pointer in C++, if you're familiar with that language. But you always want to take self as an argument, except in rare circumstances. So I'm just going to print some data values here. And if you wanted to, you could uncomment this out and print the password, but I don't want to display my password for everyone on the internet to see, so let's comment it out. But that's just some debugging data. You could comment all that out later if you want. Okay, here's an important part. We have to set up the MIME. So message MIME multipart. We're building or constructing an instance of a MIME multipart object. Okay, and you can think of that as a predefined class of object in Python. Think of it as key value pairs. So we have a variable from, to, subject, and it's going to get the data that was stored in the variables, which got their data from the entry objects and the text object on the form, right? Okay, so we do that, and then as far as from, to, subject, and then the body, okay, the body itself is what we took in not from the entry objects, but the text object, all right, and it's plain. So in this case, now we're going to use our built-in smtp.Lib and smtp, and to build an instance, all right, the server and the port, well, that's what they passed in, all right, so whatever they type in their GUI, in this case, we're going to use M365's SMTP server. It's just a authenticated SMTP server. So now with all of this data, in this case in our object, right? So it's all stored and saved inside of our MIME multipart object here. And then we're going to attach the body. We have those parameters defined, and we're going to go ahead and call sendMail. So to do that, we need to create a new session with smtp.Lib. We're going to pass in the server and the port defined from our GUI. It needs to be encrypted, so we're going to start TLS in this case. So with transport layer security, we're going to log in, and I'm using the M365, so you can't do any spoofing. This is all an authenticated SMTP server, so the sender needs to match the actual account. Now, some SMTP servers that allow anonymous SMTP, you could spoof. You could send as the server and claim to be someone totally different. But in this case, depending on who you're using for the SMTP server, if it's authenticated, you want to make sure that you're sending as a legitimate actual account, or it will be rejected because you're spoofing. And then I'm going to, I need the password. So in this case, the message text, I'm just going to as a string, all right? So convert it to a string. And then I'm going to go ahead and call sendMail and pass in the sender. There's my account, the recipient, who it's being sent to, and the message text, that was converted to a string. So the body of my text. And then when I'm done, I just want to close the session with quit. Okay, and then if that's the case, I'm just going to provide a little feedback and mail sent. I'll just say mail sent there in the console. So let's run this real quick and take a look at it and see how it looks. I'm going to press F5. And here's my interface. And in this case, all of these default values are okay. Hello email. Just type a little bit of text there, right? So I'm going to go ahead and send, and then the only thing I can't use that I set up as default was my password. So there's my email password. Okay, so mail sent, and this was sent to, in this case, the recipient, my Gmail. So let's go look at my Gmail real quick. And here we go. There. Wanted to find the right message. But all right, so here's my Gmail account. And that was sent as my Outlook account, my M365 account. Hello, email, come to the party. Sincerely, Carly. All right, so we just verified that that worked. And let's say I wanted to send it to my M365 account. All right, so I just need to change the recipient. And I have a 1 byte at a time Carly at outlook.com as well as at Gmail. So I'm just going to change the recipient here. And let's see. Duplicate to outlook.com. And mail sent. And now let me hop over to my M365 account. And here we go. See, duplicate to outlook.com. So this is a small project. It won't take you very long to code at all. But if you do, I can guarantee you'll get some good experience with Tkinter and with graphical interfaces. And all the code will be posted, like I said, on GitHub. I'll put a link beneath the video. Thanks for watching.